Obrigado to you, Alexandra, and arigato to you, Takao, for organizing today's symposium. I must say, as somebody who's been involved in energy efficiency my entire career, it is I miss seeing colleagues from around the world, and I'm glad we can do it virtually. But I hope next time we'll be able to do it in person and to be able to learn from each other's work. And I'm going to talk about our Building Energy Codes Working Group. And if I look away a little bit, it's only because my notes are on a different computer, and so I have to cheat. But so we have in the the IEA's Energy and Buildings Communities Program, we have a Building Energy Codes Working Group. This was established a few years ago, and it was commissioned by our chairman, Dr. Sawachi. And I am the chairman of it, and Michael Dunn of New Zealand is the co-chair. And then we have a very talented team who is on the call at the meeting today, including Meredith Evans and Allison Delgado from the United States Pacific Northwest National Lab, Jack Mayernick from the U.S. National Renewable Energy Lab, and Jeremy Williams, who, like me, is the United States Department of Energy, but are also our working group, and you'll see in a moment, isn't just the chairs and the staff. We have many active participants, EBC, people in the EBC family and beyond. It is open to people who are not directly connected with the EBC. And I will give you contact information. So I hope you will be able to want to join us and work with us going forward. So again, I'm sorry we're in the virtual world. I wish I was in Tokyo now, Takao, but let's do it this way this year. So that's what I want to talk about. But I mostly want to focus. We had our annual symposium just last week. I know many of you were able to participate in that, like Bjorn Olsen and Ian Hamilton. And so I'm going to cheat, and I'm going to use some of the results we had from that very successful webinar to share with you today. And that's not the only activities, but that's some of it. So again, here's our organization. I mentioned myself and my immediate colleagues in those first two bullets. But again, what's most important to us is how broad the participation is. And you can see there, in case you don't know your two-letter codes, let's see if I get it right. We have Australia, of course. Alexandra represents Brazil, Canada, China, India, Ireland, Italy, Japan, that's Takao, New Zealand, Portugal, that is not Senegal, that is Singapore, Sweden, Turkey, the United Kingdom, and the US, as well as ASHRAE and the International Code Council, because our issue is working groups. And there, if you can see, I don't know if it'll highlight, please contact allison.delgado@pnnl.gov, and please join our distribution. We're anxious to have your help. So we do several activities, and mostly our purpose is to do two things. We analyze collectively emerging issues in building codes around the world, and we do that either so we can have comparisons to see how Japan is doing it or Brazil is doing it, or in federal systems such as my own, there's a great variance at the state level. So in Canada or Brazil or the United States or Australia or other systems at the state and provincial level, and even the local level, there will be variances. So one of our activities is to analyze those different global activities. And another key, you see that, the comparative analysis. And then we also have exchanges so that we can all learn from each other's successes and mistakes. How do we do that? You can see this here. We have webinars, we have our annual symposium, we have our meetings, and then we have these reports on related issues. And if there are other issues you would like to see us analyze, I hope you will communicate with us. And if there are other issues that you have analyzed relating to building codes, we would welcome your input, and perhaps we can share your work. We also have a newsletter, etc. And we try to work with the other annexes. And so that's our approach, and we try to be inclusive as we can be. So this year, we put out 2 reports so far, and one of them as Dr. Imamura raised, is this issue of existing buildings and how do we do codes. I highly commend you to this report. I think it was released in, I want to say, June. It was done by Adam Hinge and shared by our working groups. It is very thoughtful, very exhaustive, and it includes that issue that I just raised that we're exploring in the parts of the US called the building performance standards for existing buildings, but also other approaches with codes, renovation mandates, or other approaches, again, the equipment as we discussed a few minutes ago. And just last week, in conjunction with our symposium, we issued a paper on a very difficult issue, and that is compliance. And I think we all here are sophisticated enough to know that it is important to codes. Basically, I will say, have three elements to them. First, they must be developed. Each jurisdiction, or in the US, we have model codes, but each model code body or jurisdiction has to first develop codes for certain building types and certain conditions. Next, the codes might be adopted after they've been developed. Then there is a regulatory, political, or governmental process to adopt them by the jurisdiction, but then they must be complied with by the people in the building sector. And at least in, I hope this translates well, at least in American English, and maybe all English, I'm going to make a distinction between compliance and enforcement. Compliance is what the home builder does, or the office or restaurant construction firm does. Enforcement is what the government does to ensure compliance. In other words, compliance is what a driver does if they stay under the speed limit, and enforcement is what the traffic cop does to spin the lights or maybe even write a ticket if they're in violation. So we want to focus on compliance. Enforcement is necessary, but there's just too much. It's impossible to enforce all the codes. We want to get a voluntary compliance. And that's what this new paper on best practices looks at. This certainly varies by culture, markets, and politics of local places. Our other recent webinars you can read for yourself on costs and benefits, on, as I mentioned, the existing buildings we did in conjunction with Adam's paper, and the codes around the globe. And I do want to, again, give a shout out to my colleague, Meredith Evans of the US Pacific Northwest National Lab, who is a global expert in cross-national comparison, and along with many of you. And so here's a list, and I'll give you our URL at the end. I hope you'll join us. I already mentioned this, and as I say, we looked at compliance in 11 different jurisdictions, and here are the key findings. You can read them for yourselves about pooling resources, about requiring accreditations and training for inspectors. And here's what I'll say, at least in the United States, and maybe it's the same in Brazil or Japan or China, wherever you may be. If I'm driving on the highway, I try to follow the speed limit. But if I see a policeman up ahead, I will be certain to drive. And if I see a policeman every 25 miles, I'll always follow the speed limit because I don't know if there's another policeman just around the turn. So in addition to my following the speed limit because it's safer and more fuel efficient, I also follow the speed limit if I think there is enforcement. And it doesn't matter whether or not there's enforcement as long as the party is concerned about that. So that's why it's important to have quality inspectors in sufficient number, but also, again, as I say, to have voluntary compliant. And new techniques in data, in big data, in virtualness. Since the COVID pandemic, we've learned a lot about how to do more inspections in the city of North Las Vegas, United States. They've been a leader in the United States about using virtual inspections and using data and remote tools such as cell phone camera, iPad cameras, or drones to collect data and get to more buildings more accurately. All right, we had our symposium last week, and I'm just going to go through some of the highlights of it today, and there's more of them in the PowerPoint that you can look at afterwards. And we had 2 panels, and our approach was to do some recordings before, and then to do some of it live. And you can see we had 2 panels. The first one, of course, it's such a key issue in the field of building codes. And I should have said at the beginning, building codes have been around for many decades around the world. well, building codes for safety, for fire, but building energy codes have been around the world, especially since the 1970s. And but they are having a new life. I think the European Union has led the way as the European Union embraced the Paris Accord and realized that remembered that building codes are an essential tool for achieving carbon reductions. And they may not be as glamorous as electric vehicles or as innovative or new in some places as heat pumps, but they are so effective. And so we had presentations from the Northeast United States, from Takao on Japan, and from Dr. Zhang, I'll get into from China, on focusing on carbon reductions. Of course, anything that saves energy will help with carbon reductions, but there can be different focuses. And the second panel was looking at different roadmaps on dealing with building codes and how they fit in the bigger picture. And we heard from Brazil and Canada. So here, I'm going to do some of the highlights, and there are others. But we are fortunate today because, look, I can try to explain the work of Professor Ian Hamilton of University College London's Energy Institute. And look at this. If you can read this, you have excellent vision. Congratulations. But we have Dr. Hamilton with us. And Ian, do you mind? Can you give us 60 seconds and tell us about your findings rather than having me try to translate? Thank you.
So this is a slide that showcases two things. One is on the left side, the nationally determined contributions that were submitted leading up to the COP26 this year. And what they highlight is within those NDCs that buildings are, and energy efficiency of buildings, improvements particularly, are the second most common way in which they countries are electing to aim to achieve their determined contributions. So this is really important. It means that buildings, which, as the IEA point out, are around 40% of all emissions, energy-related emissions, are incredibly important towards achieving this. And on the right-hand side, very briefly as well, David, these are roadmaps for building and construction that the IEA and Global Alliance for Building and Construction have put together. And the roadmap set out a pathway to 2050. And they look at 8 different themes: existing buildings, new buildings, urban planning, etc. But within existing buildings and new buildings, key among them are the policies related to building energy codes and the need for countries to adopt both voluntary, to move away from just purely voluntary, which are the majority of codes that exist in the world. One other thing that was reported this past year is that of all the countries in the world, 43 of them have mandatory codes and not necessarily applied to all sectors, as you also heard today. So this roadmap highlights the importance that codes will play, and that transition towards a more a code that has a higher stringency and a stretch element to it to ensure that we're meeting that decarbonization. Thanks, David. Over to you.
Thank you, Ian. And I'm sure if you want to contact Ian, well, we'll have time in a few minutes or after the event. He'll be happy to follow up. And Ian, one thing that your roadmap does so well, that at least raises an issue we won't have time, but this is what the symposium about, is how to building codes. We know the size of the challenge globally for climate change, therefore for efficiency, therefore building efficiency. But as you can see on the right of your slide, Ian, the roadmap, how do building codes fit in and how do they connect with other policy and market interventions so that we could have synergistic results? So that's a big, almost religious question that you raised. Thank you so much. Next, let me turn to Canada. And I can't see everybody in the audience. I don't know if Millie Stiliano, our EBC Executive Committee representative from Canada, is at the symposium today. I bet he is. But we had a presentation from his colleague, Alex Ferguson, in Natural Resources Canada, about building codes in Canada. And I don't need to show you a map to know that Canada is a country with a lot of heating. But what's important to realize, that it's easy for us, especially in the United States, to forget, is that much of Canada increasingly relies on air conditioning. And in some years, Ontario, which is either the most popular, one of the 2 most populous provinces in Canada, maybe the #1. In some years, Ontario has more electricity demand in summer than winter because of all the demand for air conditioning in the Toronto and southern area. And so again, they are not only making their codes, looking at their codes more stringently, but figuring out a broader approach for the role of building codes. And Alex Ferguson shared that with us at our session. And he looked again at the carbon issue. Canada certainly committed to the Paris Accords. Also, he raised some issues that are important. We won't have time to get into existing buildings again, but this is two other issues. One is that of embodied carbon. And I hope we all know that we're making some progress globally, some places more than others, on operational energy, and operational carbon in buildings, reducing the carbon footprint of air conditioning and lighting and other end uses in buildings. But the carbon that's embodied in the building themselves, from the materials, from the construction techniques, and from the equipment, is very significant, and we're not making progress. And Canada is exploring, as are some in my country, exploring codes that might either incentivize or maybe even in the future regulate the carbon that's embodied. It's a very tough challenge because it's not just the materials. It's not just getting steel or glass or cement that has less carbon in it. That's one approach that's very important. It also means perhaps switching construction materials from concrete to advanced wood products such as cross-laminated timber, but it also means different construction techniques, ways to design and construct buildings that just use less cement and waste less cement. So there are a lot of different approaches. It's very hard to measure, but it's something we need to work on. And also in Canada, the city of Vancouver is helping lead the way. They're looking at different approaches, not just using model reference buildings, but also other approaches such as percent reductions and other ways to measure codes. And Alex presented on that. Next, we heard from China, from Professor Dr. Xinkong Zhang, who's with the Chinese Academy of Building Research, back to roadmaps. And I don't know the current numbers, but in any given year, we all know that in China, there is as much new construction as there is. Some years we say as much as they're building a new Chicago, Illinois in 1 year, or they have as much construction as the EU does. We all know how significant new construction is in China, and therefore they have an opportunity with new construction that other countries may or may not have. And Professor Zhang looked at that roadmap, and you can see from his functions here the ambition that he has modeled and he would like to see for the future, and that perhaps will be adopted in China, again, not just by the government, but then complied with by local construction techniques to get it. You can see the baseline from 1980. You can see the progress they've made to today. That's better progress than the US has made, certainly on a percentage basis, but there's still a lot left to go. And for many jurisdictions, the goal they want to get to, that Professor Zhang made explicit, is to get to zero energy buildings, or near zero, or net zero, but something pretty close to zero. And maybe it's by 2030, maybe it's by 2040. But what's important for me to underscore is buildings vary enormously, whether they're single family residential, multifamily residential, all right, office buildings or warehouses or hospitals. And depending on the climate of the country, we saw the range earlier of the range in Japanese climate. We have a big variance in the United States. China certainly does. So there are a lot of factors. So we use a shorthand to talk about the buildings, but there's variance, and you can see from Professor Zhang's work on the right that building codes and improved standards are going to make progress, but how that fits in their roadmap with other techniques, such as integrating renewables with clean heating and clean electrification. And that is a common theme, and something I will say that the Biden administration and my agency, the U.S. Department of Energy, is very focused on right now. How do we integrate energy efficiency with electrification, with clean heating, bring in variable renewables, and grid connectedness and flexible demand? How do building codes contribute to that? Finally, for today, I want to share some of the work from Japan, our host today. And we've had some very interesting work presented by Dr. Suwachi Takao. Would you mind sharing, giving us a summary of your work today, since you were here with us, of course?
Yes, yes. There are two things included in this paper. On the left-hand side, you can see the trend of actual end-use energy consumption for commercial and other sectors and residential sectors. Commercial and other sectors represent the energy consumption by non-residential buildings, while residential sector represent the energy consumption by houses, residential buildings. And you can see the through line starting from 1990 to 2019, which is the latest available statistics in Japan. You can see the decrease has started around 2005 something. And I wrote down two dotted line which connects the actual energy consumption in 2013 fiscal year and the latest target of Japan for 2030. So you can check whether the present situation is good or bad when you consider about reaching the target in 2030. In my opinion, it is not so bad. We are following the targeted decrease of energy consumption in those two relevant sectors. On the right-hand side, you can see the distribution of building energy index we are using to confirm compliance of the building energy performance to the standard building energy index, which is the ratio between calculated design energy consumption of the building divided by the standard energy consumption for the evaluated building. So if the building energy index is less than 1, they comply to the standard. So this kind of figures can be drawn by us because we are applying online program for calculation for compliance checking. In the central computer, there is accumulation of files used for the calculation, so that after the fiscal year we can calculate. We can make statistics. The distribution of the BEI for applied buildings. This is only from fiscal year 2019 and only from region 6, including covering Tokyo and Osaka major city in the main island, and only from office buildings. The total number is about 7,700. So we will be able to using this kind of statistics to know the situation year by year, to judge whether it will be necessary to strengthen the policies, something like that. So this kind of information can be very useful for making a future policy. Thank you very much, David. That's all.
Thank you so much, Takao, for that very interesting, important work. Before I conclude, I just want to say, if you look at these slides later, there are 2 additional slides. Alexandra, I took the liberty, since you and I are on this panel, I put us in the appendix, in the cheap seats, as we say. So there's a slide on the United States and a slide on Brazil, and you all can, Professor Roberto Lamberts from Brazil and my colleague Darren Port from the US presented there, so you can look at that later. But I just want to again thank you. Here's a link the links to the, and it might just be easier to Google these things if you can't write them down or wait for this, but the symposium we had last week, the presentations, including videos, can all be found at that URL. Our working group is there. Alison Delgado is our ambassador or emissary to the world. And also I want to say one other event that has nothing to do with our working group, but I just want to put in a pitch to our colleagues at the International Energy Agency. They, as many of you have probably been active in, they have stood up a new energy efficiency hub. This is in many ways succeeds IPEAC, which you might have worked with. So the new hub is getting going. The US is a charter and proud member, as are many other countries here. And they will have their launch event on December 1. Their website isn't fully constructed yet, but that launch event site, I tested it, it is live, and you can register for their launch event on December 1. So I'm looking forward to joining them for that and to working with the hub in the future on these related issues. And that's the final theme I want to conclude on, is that whether it's building codes, new technology, or new energy efficiency technology, or new related technologies such as electric vehicles and photovoltaics, grid interactivity, whether it's voluntary market transformation, information for consumers, these are all interconnected tools, and we need to work on them together. And so thank you again to Cal for organizing today's symposium, and I will turn it back to you, Alexandra.